Welcome to No Self-Actualization. This is Lesson 3, the Third Noble Truth. Welcome back, everyone. In this lesson, we're going to explore the Buddha's Third Noble Truth. I hope at the end of this lesson, you will begin to see that there is a way out of suffering and begin to expand your conceptual frameworks about yourself. So, let's get started. A quick recap. In the First Noble Truth, we learned that life is dukkha. That dukkha has three characteristics: dissatisfaction, impermanence, and conditional states. We also learned that these are aspects of reality that can seem to us that we cannot stop from happening. Sometimes there will be dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction is an aspect of dukkha. This can come in the form of emotional pain of a loved one's death, or in physical pain to the body by breaking a bone. Impermanence is another aspect of dukkha. I'm sure you're all well aware that there is nothing that isn't subjected to the constraints of time. Your body gets older, your energy levels drop. Eventually, you will die. Life is impermanent. Then there is conditional states, which is yet another aspect of dukkha. We can, and often do, suffer over the causal nature of the environment in which we are currently inhabiting. If a wildfire decimates your home, you can suffer tremendously over this. In the lesson on the Second Noble Truth, we learned that suffering has a cause, that the cause is directly related to our craving or desire. We also learned that craving or desire has three basic aspects: ignorance, attachments, and resistance. It is the Buddha's claim that your cravings stem from the ignorance of identification. That is, we suffer because we believe that we are somehow a separate self or an independent agent, free of conditional states. We also suffer because of our attachments to our cravings. When we crave something, material possessions, wealth, power, and yes, identifying as any number of roles that we play, these will inevitably lead to suffering. Why? Because these things are impermanent. Whatever they are, they will eventually end. To attach ourselves to these things is to suffer over the impermanence of reality. Resistance is another aspect of craving. We do this when we deny what is. This is almost always related to dissatisfaction of something. If someone cuts you off in traffic, you can get angry at that person for doing that thing to you. In this instance, we are resisting what has already happened and simultaneously attaching ourselves to what we believe reality should be, not what reality actually is. A sort of double whammy of dukkha. Why do we do this? Once again, we do this because of our ignorance of identification as a self. Ignorance, attachment, and resistance are a sort of rabbit hole of craving or desire. When stuck in this vicious cycle, suffering is bound to happen over and over again. This is the problem that the Buddha was well aware of. While meditating under the Bodhi tree, he came to realize that because there is dukkha, and there is a cause to dukkha, that there has to be a way out of dukkha. This is what he would later refer to as the Third Noble Truth. The Third Noble Truth. The Third Noble Truth is known as the Noble Truth of the cessation of dukkha. The Buddha is pointing out that suffering can be eliminated. How? By letting go of the cravings, specifically letting go of our ignorance, attachment, and resistance. These three poisons cause us to suffer. Therefore, to end suffering, we have to rid ourselves of the poisons that we're ingesting. Quote, "Cessation of suffering as a noble truth is this. It is remainderless, fading and ceasing, giving up, relinquishing, letting go and rejecting of that same craving." End quote. Gautama Buddha, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. A personal experience. I'm going to walk you through a real-life example of suffering that I experienced somewhat recently. A few weeks ago, I was walking to the grocery store to pick up some food. On my way there, I saw some trash on the ground. I started to become agitated over this. Note the dissatisfaction and conditioned states. I could feel my muscles tense up and could hear the voice in my head say something to the effect of, "No one else cares about the environment. The whole world is just their personal trash bin." I was resisting what already is. I could literally feel the suffering I was creating over this situation. I was also attaching my identification as a self to this. I know this because of the inner dialogue about no one else caring about the environment. This is akin to me saying that I'm the only person who cares about the environment. If this is true, then of course I'm bound to suffer because I've established a narrative of self. So just in this short time span, I've checked off almost all of the first and second noble truths. It's important to know that this all happened within what seemed to be no less than 10 seconds before I became aware of my reaction. Once aware, I then asked myself, in my head, why was I so upset about this? I then waited for a response. I realized that me getting upset does not change the fact that there was trash on the ground, conditional states. I also realized that in that moment, I was dissatisfied with the way things were and wanted a clean street. So I was resistant to the situation I found myself in. I was also resistant to the feelings that came up. I also became aware of my thoughts as identifying as a self, that this was happening to me. This is how ignorance causes us to suffer. So I was ignorant of my established narrative of self. After this insightful moment, I realized that there was no point in getting upset and ultimately suffering. So I dropped the thought altogether. I then picked up the trash and threw it in a trash can, and went about the rest of my day and felt great. Note that in order to drop the thought, I had to first become aware of the thought. Becoming aware of the thought allows us to contemplate the validity of it. Quote, "Since the source of the problem is that our way of experiencing things is misaligned with the world, it is important to think and examine both our outlook and the world very carefully. Doctors have to closely examine a patient's body and some pretty disgusting symptoms to figure out what disease someone has, what caused it, and how to treat it. In the same way, we have to look closely at the world and some ugly features of it to figure out the source of the problem and how to solve it. In both cases, this involves a lot of trial and error. But luckily, we don't have to start from scratch. Just as doctors today build on years of medical research and attempts to cure different ailments, Buddhists can draw on thousands of years of philosophy, psychology, and practical experience to help solve the problem." End quote. Nicholas Bomarito, Seeing Clearly, Guides to the Good Life. Now, I'm not saying that I achieved nirvana as a result of this situation. Far from it. But I did and do consider this instance a breakthrough moment of clarity. A moment where I stepped outside of the story I was telling myself, and I began to see the interconnectedness of our thoughts, feelings, and emotions. How this is all one process taking place. In a sense, I was being honest and acknowledging the suffering that was happening and seeing if that suffering was congruent with reality. After careful examination, I decided it was not congruent with reality. So I let it go. This is what is referred to as radical acceptance. Radical acceptance is an acknowledgement of reality to play out without any cravings for it to be a certain way. When we let go of the narrative, we see reality for what it really is. We see the abundance and limitless connections between the so-called things that are outside of us. We begin to feel compassion for those who are trapped in their ignorance, attachments, and resistance. We have a newfound wisdom of how we create our suffering and how we can let it go. And lastly, we are mindful of our actions, karma, and how they can and do affect others. Conclusion. There is a way out of dukkha. This is the Buddha's third noble truth, the cessation of dukkha. This is accomplished by letting go of our attachments to our cravings, by dropping our resistance to what is, and by accepting reality without any contingencies. And lastly, by realizing we are not a self, that our boundaries are conceptual and limiting and ultimately not real. If you do not yet feel this truth, let that be okay. The Buddha is ultimately trying to get you to let go of your beliefs about who you perceive yourself to be. This is probably one of the hardest, if not the hardest, realization a human being can strive for in the lifetime provided. It will not come to you overnight. Know that just contemplating this is itself a step in the right direction. Take solace in the fact that you're here because you want the suffering to end. We all do. I hope this lesson was helpful and want you to gain these insights practically. So please commit yourself to following these noble truths. If you're stuck and can't make sense of something, please reach out, either through the comments, chat section, or a direct message if that's more comfortable for you. In the next lesson on the fourth noble truth, we will be discussing the Buddha's ethics and how, living by these ethics, we can rid ourselves of our sense of self. Until then, be well.